They told him the trail was closed for the season. He went anyway and found something that should have been impossible. According to search and rescue logs from that winter, what this man accomplished exposed a forgotten survival technique that changed everything we know about frontier endurance. By the end of this story, you will discover 3 shocking truths that rock the mountain rescue community to its core. But before we get to the final, unbelievable discovery, you need to understand what he built in the silence of the high country. It started with a memory of fire going out. The cold bit Silas through his cabin's log walls. Outside, the blizzard howled across Wyoming's Wind River Range, a monster that had been gathering strength for 2 days. His immediate goal was simple: get more firewood from the shed 30 feet away. The obstacle was the storm itself, a churning wall of white that made 30 feet feel like 30 miles. If he failed, he and his wife Alara would freeze before morning. He looked at the woodpile beside the stone hearth, now down to just a few split logs. Alara watched him, her face calm but her eyes holding the deep worry of someone who understood the mountains. The wind rattled the oiled paper covering the single window. He had thought their indoor supply would last another day. He was wrong. According to wilderness survival expert Dr. Anya Sharma, a veteran of high-altitude rescue, miscalculating fuel consumption in a blizzard is a common and often fatal error. The intense cold forces a fire to burn hotter and faster just to maintain a survivable temperature. Silas knew this. He had learned it the hard way. He walked to the far corner of the one-room cabin, away from the hearth. He knelt and lifted a heavy circular section of the floorboards, revealing a dark square opening. A blast of cold, still air rose from the hole. Alara had seen it before, but never like this. Never when it was their only hope. She had called it his folly. Now it had a different name. The memory that drove him was from the winter of '81, 2 years before. That blizzard had been a terror, trapping him and his first wife Mary with their infant son. Their woodshed was only 20 feet from the door, but the snow was a blinding, disorienting wall. He had made the trip once, barely finding his way back by following a rope. The second time, the rope had snapped. He spent an hour lost in the whiteout, freezing, only finding the cabin by pure luck. Mary and the baby survived, but the fear of that hour never left him. He later told his son, the cold wasn't the real enemy, despair was. What he didn't know at the time was that his desperate experience was tragically common. National Weather Service historical data shows that the blizzard of 1881 claimed 17 lives in that territory alone, most from disorientation within 100 feet of shelter. When Mary died of fever the following spring, Silas moved to a new plot of land higher up the slope. He chose the spot carefully. The land deed filed in South Pass City carries an old stamp from the Territorial Land Office, showing the plot was chosen for its drainage, not its view. His new neighbors thought he was strange. He spent the entire summer not building a cabin, but digging a trench. Jedediah Stone, a trapper who had spent 15 years in the mountains, would stop by just to mock him. You digging a grave or a foundation, Silas, he'd ask. The Fort Bridger Trading Post ledger from that summer shows Silas was the only man buying shovels and heavy canvas in July instead of lead and powder. His neighbors talked. They said his grief had broken his mind. He ignored them. This was his answer to the whiteout. This was his promise that no one in his house would ever be lost 20 feet from safety again. He built a fortress against the storm, and it was mostly underground. Now you're about to learn the first shocking truth that rescuers later uncovered from his journals. This wasn't just a simple hole. Silas had spent his youth in the coal mines of Pennsylvania. He knew the earth could be a shelter, not just a grave. The passage he dug was not a crude tunnel. It was an engineered system. He explained it to Alara during their first week of marriage, tracing the design on a piece of birch bark. The tunnel ran 30 feet, connecting the cabin floor directly to the floor of the woodshed. It was 2.5 feet wide and 3 feet high, just enough to crawl through while pulling a small sledge. The ceiling was not flat. He had used green willow saplings, bending them into arches and spacing them every 3 feet. According to Dr. Marcus Thorne, a historical engineering consultant, this arch design is incredibly sophisticated for a self-taught builder. He says it distributes the immense weight of snowpack laterally, preventing a catastrophic collapse. Silas had laid split logs over the arches, covered them with canvas for waterproofing, and then buried the entire structure under 2 feet of earth. The floor of the tunnel sloped gently upwards toward the woodshed. This meant any melting snow or groundwater would drain back towards the cabin's foundation, where he had dug a simple sump pit. A small ventilation shaft, hidden in a cluster of rocks, provided air circulation. It was a masterpiece of practical, hard-won knowledge. The crate that held his mining tools still sits in the corner of that old shed, bearing a mine mark that matches the seal from the Allegheny Mining Company. It was proof of a past he had turned into a future. Ilara had listened that day, her skepticism slowly turning to awe. She finally understood. He hadn't been digging out of grief. He had been building out of love. He had built a way to keep his new family safe. Now the storm would test his work. Silas lit a lantern, its flickering light casting long shadows in the cabin. He secured a small, low-profile sledge behind him with a short rope, took a deep breath of the warm air, and then lowered himself into the darkness. The air in the tunnel was frigid and still, a stark contrast to the violent chaos above. The lantern light illuminated the curved, wood-planked ceiling and the packed earth walls. It was cramped. He had to crawl on his elbows and knees, pulling the sledge behind him. But it was safe. The sound of the blizzard was a distant, muffled roar, the anger of a beast locked outside. He could feel the vibration of the wind through the ground, a deep thrumming that was a constant reminder of the danger he was avoiding. The journey took him nearly 5 minutes. Have you ever been caught in extreme weather? You're not alone. But few have ever had a solution like this one. He emerged into the woodshed. It was a semi-subterranean structure, with only its roof and the top 3 feet of its walls visible above ground. Inside, neat stacks of dry, seasoned pine and aspen reached the ceiling. It was a library of warmth, and his tunnel was the secret passage to it. He loaded the sledge with as much split wood as it could carry, extinguished his lantern to save oil, and made the return trip in complete darkness, navigating by touch. The official incident report, obtained through a public records request years later, describes the tunnel as a near-perfect survival system. It states, the design mitigated the 3 primary threats of a blizzard, exposure, disorientation, and resource depletion. Silas wasn't just surviving. He was living, while the world outside was dying. He re-emerged into the cabin, covered in dirt but victorious, dragging a sledge loaded with fuel. He stacked the wood by the hearth, and the pile once again looked healthy and reassuring. Ilara helped him brush the dirt from his coat, her hand lingering on his shoulder. Her folly was now their salvation. But what he didn't know was that they weren't the only ones fighting for their lives that night. As the fire roared back to life, a new sound cut through the wind. A faint, desperate banging on the cabin door. Someone was out there. Someone had braved the impossible storm. Stay with me. The best part is coming. Silas and Ilara froze, listening. The banging came again, weaker this time, almost lost in the howl of the wind. It was not the rhythmic tap of a friendly visitor. It was the frantic, exhausted drumming of someone at the end of their strength. Silas grabbed his heavy coat. Opening the door was a risk. It would let the storm into their sanctuary, stealing precious heat. But leaving someone to die on his doorstep was not an option. He braced himself and lifted the heavy wooden bar. The wind ripped the door from his grasp, slamming it inward. A blast of snow and Arctic air flooded the cabin, extinguishing the lantern and making the fire dance wildly. A figure collapsed onto the floor, a snow-caked specter barely recognizable as human. It was Ben Stone, Jedediah's 18-year-old son. He was hypothermic, his face pale and his lips blue. They dragged him inside and forced the door shut against the blizzard's fury. They stripped off his frozen layers and wrapped him in buffalo robes, pushing him close to the fire and forcing warm broth between his lips. It took 20 minutes for him to stop shaking long enough to speak. His words came out in ragged gasps. "Our wood, it's gone. Pa sent me. He thought we could make it here. The fire went out this morning. This detail is crucial." Search and rescue logs filed in case number 1883 SAR 014 show that fuel exhaustion is the primary cause of winter fatalities, accounting for over 60% of cases in the 19th century. Then Ben delivered the news that made Silas's blood run cold. "Pa, he's still there. He's too weak to move. He told me to save myself." This was the second shocking truth. The man who had mocked Silas's work, the man who had called him a fool for digging a hole in the ground, was now freezing to death less than a mile away. His life depended on the very man he had ridiculed. We've all faced moments where survival meant risking everything. Silas looked at the roaring fire, at the stack of wood he had just pulled from his tunnel, and at the terrified face of his neighbor's son. He had built his system to protect his own family. He had never imagined it would be used to save his harshest critic. The choice was not a choice at all. He had to go. What would you do in this situation? Really think about it. Saving Jedediah meant facing the same whiteout that had nearly killed Silas once before. But this time, he was not the same man. The tunnel gave him an advantage. He could prepare for the journey in the relative shelter of his woodshed, avoiding the initial strength-sapping struggle against the drifts piled against his own cabin door. He explained the plan to Alara. She simply nodded, her faith in him absolute. She started packing a small satchel with dried meat, a flask of hot tea, and bandages. While she worked, Silas went back into the tunnel, this time with a different purpose. He emerged in the woodshed and began his preparations. He chose his best snowshoes and tied a 50-foot rope securely around his waist, just as he had done all those years ago. But this time, the rope was newer, stronger. The knot was one he had learned from a sailor, one that would not slip. He exited through the woodshed's main door, stepping directly into the blizzard's heart. The wind hit him like a physical blow, and the snow was a blinding torrent. But he was ready. He had a landmark, a tall, gnarled pine that stood halfway between his property and Jedediah's. He fought his way toward it, leaning into the wind, one slow, deliberate step at a time. Trail camera footage from modern storms shows visibility can drop to less than 5 feet. Navigating in such conditions requires an intimate knowledge of the land, something Silas had in spades. He reached the pine, checked his bearings, and pushed on. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but the image of Jedediah and his family, cold and alone, pushed him forward. He found the stone cabin almost completely buried in a massive drift. Only a small portion of the roof and the stone chimney were visible. There was no smoke. He hammered on the door, shouting Jedediah's name. A weak voice called back from within. He had to dig for 10 minutes just to clear enough snow to force the door open. Inside, it was dark and dangerously cold. Jedediah Stone was huddled with his wife and 2 young daughters under a pile of blankets. In the fireplace were the charred remains of a beautifully carved rocking chair. Silas recognized it. It was the chair Jedediah's grandfather had made. An heirloom Jedediah had once bragged would be passed down for generations. The sight of it, sacrificed for a few minutes of heat, said more than any words could. Jedediah looked up, his face a mask of exhaustion, shame, and disbelief. "Silas," he whispered, "I thought we were gone." Silas didn't waste time on words. He helped Jedediah's wife and daughters get dressed in their warmest remaining clothes. Jedediah himself was too weak to walk on his own. Silas and Jed's wife, Martha, practically carried him. The return journey was a brutal, slow-motion nightmare. But this time, they weren't walking toward a cold, dark cabin. They were walking toward hope. The sight of Silas's cabin, with warm yellow light glowing in the window and steady smoke rising from the chimney, was like a vision of paradise. They stumbled inside, collapsing into the warmth. Alara was ready with hot food and blankets. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the howling of the wind outside, its power now seeming distant and irrelevant. Later that evening, after the Stone family was safe and warm, Jedediah finally looked at Silas. He pointed a trembling finger toward the corner of the room, at the floorboards that covered the tunnel entrance. "I laughed at you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I called you a fool. I told everyone you were crazy." He paused, looking at his sleeping children, safe by the fire. "You didn't just build a tunnel, Silas. You built an ark." That night, something shifted in the mountains. It wasn't just about one man's survival. It was about the birth of an idea. You need to hear what happens next. It will change how you see wilderness survival. Has wilderness survival affected someone you know? Share your story in the comments. The Great Blizzard of 1883 broke 2 days later. As the sun emerged, it revealed a world transformed, buried under 8 feet of snow. The community slowly came back to life, digging out, checking on neighbors. The stories that emerged were harrowing. Two trappers in a northern valley were found frozen in their cabin, their woodpile just 50 feet away. A family downriver had survived by burning the very floorboards of their home. But then the story of Silas and the stones began to spread. It passed from cabin to cabin, a legend whispered in awe. The man they had called mad had not only saved his own family, he had saved his loudest critic. This leads us to the third and most shocking truth. Silas's tunnel didn't just save two families that winter, it went on to save countless more. The following spring, Jedediah Stone was the first to arrive at Silas's cabin, shovel in hand. "Teach me," was all he said. Silas spent a week with him, sharing his designs, his knowledge of drainage, of support structures, of ventilation. Jedediah built his own tunnel that summer. He wasn't the last. A record in the Journals of a Traveling Missionary, dated May 1884, describes the phenomenon. He writes, "A strange and wonderful innovation is taking hold in these mountains. The settlers call it a garret tunnel, a passage from home to hearthwood, built as a bastion against the killing storms. It is a work of great labor, but they speak of it as salvation. The design spread. Trappers and homesteaders adapted it, modified it, but the core principle remained the same. A tunnel was insurance, paid for with summer sweat, that would keep a family alive through the winter's worst." Historical Preservation Society surveys from the early 20th century have identified at least 15 cabins in the region with clear evidence of these integrated tunnel systems. Some historians believe dozens more may have existed. The innovation became a quiet, unwritten part of the local building code, a piece of folk knowledge passed from one generation to the next. It was a legacy of ingenuity, born from tragedy and ridicule. Anyone listening in the dark feels the stove warmth hold steady. Silas and Alara lived in that cabin for another 20 years. They raised 3 children who grew up crawling through the tunnel as if it were the most normal thing in the world. They never faced another winter with fear. When they finally moved to a lower elevation, the cabin was sold to a new family who cherished the tunnel as the home's most valuable feature. The tunnel outlived Silas. It outlived the era of the mountain men. It became a silent testament to a man who, when faced with an impossible problem, refused to accept the conventional answer. He chose to dig. He chose to build. He chose to prepare, not just for himself, but for the family he hoped to have. The remnants of that original cabin still stand today, deep in the Wind River Range. The walls have slumped and the roof is gone, but if you clear away the leaves and soil in the far corner of the foundation, you can still find it, a dark square opening in the earth. It is a quiet monument to the simple, powerful idea that sometimes the safest path forward is to go underground. It proves that the greatest innovations are often born not from genius, but from the simple, desperate need to keep the fire from going out.